Thank you, Karen. As many of you are aware, there's been a large increase in the production of oil and gas in the United States. And I'm going to be presenting some recent data that's been compiled that will help understand the geography of that development and also some of the local consequences. And then I'll also survey some of the recent research on local issues surrounding this recent wave of oil and gas development. What's driving this expansion in oil and gas production that we've seen? It's coming from shale formations. Shale is a type of rock. It's located throughout the U.S., and it contains a lot of oil and gas. Why are we extracting this oil and gas now? Because the technology is there to do it profitably. The two key pieces of technology that have developed over the last few decades and been refined and combined with great effect are horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. You can see in the top left corner of this graphic the characteristics of a conventional natural gas well, where you would sink a vertical well down, hit a pocket of gas, and it will come out. This more recent development is from oil and gas that's trapped in shale, which tends to be thin and cover a large geographic area. To effectively capture or draw the oil and gas out of that shale, it's much more effective to drill sideways through the shale strata. Another difference with shale is that the resource is not sitting there in an open pocket, but it's in tiny, even microscopic pores. To release the oil and gas from the shale, hydraulic fracturing is needed, and that's where liquids are used under high pressure to break up that shale so that the oil and gas can flow into the wellbore along that horizontal stem and then flow to the surface. This is a map of the major shale plays. You can see it's covering many parts of the country. Many states are involved, and these are only the major plays, and this map evolves as more exploration occurs. And it's only considering shale plays, not sandstone plays, which are very similar to shale plays, and in some cases also have a substantial resource. Now, as I've mentioned, production has been growing, and to put that in perspective, this graph is quite revealing. Production of natural gas has increased by about 20% since the mid-2000s, but that is a small increase compared to what is expected. By 2040, under these scenarios projected by the Energy Information Administration, we're expecting a roughly doubling of natural gas production relative to the levels from the mid-2000s. Now, the United States is already a large producer of natural gas, one of the major producers in the world, so a doubling of our production is a big deal. The story for oil is slightly different. Again, production is expected to increase for the next 5 or so years, but there's a lot more uncertainty surrounding what will happen after that. As the technology evolves and more is learned about these plays, that uncertainty will decrease. But as you can see, there's quite a range of potential outcomes over the longer term. But in all these scenarios that the EIA has put out for oil production in the U.S., production in 2040 is, in all scenarios, greater than production at any time in the decade of the 2000s. This oil and gas development, particularly using high-volume hydraulic fracturing, has generated a lot of local issues, and I'm sure many of you have read about them to some extent in the popular press. The issues are cross-cutting across environmental, economic, and social questions. And to understand these local impacts, disaggregated data are essential. And The Energy Information Administration had previously, or still, only publishes state production quantities and well counts. And that's too aggregate of a level to gain much understanding of local impacts. So the Economic Research Service developed a county-level database. Now, what exactly did we create? Again, it's county level. It's oil and gas production. It's annual onshore production for the years 2000 through to 2011 for all states in the lower 48 that had some oil and gas production in 2011, according to the EIA. We compiled these data, drawing from data collected by state agencies charged with managing oil and gas development. Well operators in almost all states, I think all states, are required to file well reports with the appropriate state agency, and those data then can be used to aggregate up and create county totals. The work involves substantial standardizing of information across states, central data cleaning, and then fact-checking and quality control. It was quite a bit of work. But it is completed, and there in these maps you can see some of the fruit of the endeavor. You can see there's a lot of geographic variation in production. This is oil and gas production in 2011 with counties shaded by the quantile of production. You can see within a state there are places that have tremendous production and places that have zero production. So state-level data is not tremendously helpful when studying local impacts. Another depiction of these data are shown in this map. We combined oil and gas production using a decade average price for oil and gas, and then we graphed those counties that had at least a $20 million increase in production from 2000 to 2011, and those with at least a $20 million decrease. And I'll just point out three things. One, there's as many decline counties as there are increased counties. Two, the decreased counties tend to be geographic neighbors of the increased counties. And a third point that you can't infer from this, but that I can tell you from looking at the data, is that employment growth in decreased counties has been similar to that of employment in increased counties, both of which have been much higher than employment growth elsewhere. And I think that suggests that counties or areas with the industry-specific capital and know-how, in other words, a history of working in oil and gas, have benefited by growth in the industry in their state, and so are doing better economically. These data have already been put to good use and are expected to be used to look at issues like, is the new development happening in areas with historical production? They tend to be in more rural areas, in lower income areas, and then understanding some of the local consequences. So researchers can use the variation across time and across space in production to look at environmental and health outcomes, the local economy and employment, real estate values, and so forth. And a variety of institutions have already been using the data, and I've listed a few there. Now I'm going to turn to some recent research on local consequences, some of which employs these data. I'm going to talk about four topics. One, I'll broadly label disamenities associated with oil and gas development, local economic impacts, some implications for public finance, and then agriculture. Let's start with disamenities. I like the term amenity or disamenity. It's a broad but sufficiently concrete term. Amenity is really anything that provides comfort or pleasure. They are things you want to live nearby. A disamenity is the opposite. And oil and gas development certainly has some disamenities associated with it. Hydraulic fracturing a well requires many tractor-trailer or semi-truck trips to the well site. So there's an increase in truck traffic that is certainly felt by local residents. There's groundwater concerns stemming from a variety of potential contamination sources, concerns about air quality from diesel generators on drilling sites, all of which may manifest themselves in human health. There is some preliminary research on showing increased accidents in Pennsylvania as well drilling took off. That's not too surprising given the tremendous amount of traffic associated with drilling. There's also some research, pretty rigorous research, showing that women who were pregnant and living nearby a well, their babies showed lower APGAR scores than the babies of women who were pregnant and in an area where there was not drilling. And of course, there's a lot more going on into that research, but the general conclusion is that there does seem to be, at least for Pennsylvania and Colorado over the study period, some negative effect on infant health, which is certainly a concern. These disamenity issues then manifest themselves in housing values. People like to live near amenities, and they'll pay more to live there, and the opposite is true for disamenities. There's some research in Pennsylvania showing some negative effects of having a well located near the home. One study finds that effect is temporary. The other shows it's limited to groundwater-dependent properties, likely reflecting the perception of potential risk to groundwater. A study that I've been working on with colleagues in the Barnett Shale of Texas shows a mixed story, one where housing in the shale appreciates more than housing outside the shale, but then there's a negative effect of greater intensity of drilling in your area. So the more wells per square kilometer in the zip code, the less you appreciate. Many people and many stories in the press have revolved around employment impacts, and it's clear that extraction does create jobs. It does draw people to the county, though perhaps not as much as some have projected initially. Looking at counties in 3 western states that had a natural gas production boom, I found that on average the boom counties saw a 1,700 job increase and about a $2,000 increase in median household income over the study period. 2 other studies have looked at the jobs created outside of the mining sector, finding that a little more than 1 non-mining job is created for each mining job. And that's quite lower than what some input-output models have suggested, some of which have multipliers on the range of 10 jobs for each mining job. This increase in employment has also, in some cases, brought some modest increases in wages or average compensation per job, but it seems like those increases have been moderated by people moving from elsewhere to take them, though it's certainly true that that result will vary by region. The more remote you are, the further people have to travel, the more difficult it is for people to come into that labor market, the more likely that wages will appreciate and rise. These are some results from looking at the Fork State area of Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma over the 2000 to 2010 period. And over that period, these 4 states accounted for about 2/3 of the total increase in natural gas production in the U.S. So it's a good place to look. And there are 2 takeaway points from this. Well, first, the general idea was to estimate for each billion cubic feet increase in gas production over that decade, how many jobs were created, how many people were attracted to the county. And the 2 numbers to take away is that for each natural gas industry-related mining job, there were about 1.4 jobs created in the non-mining sector. For each job created, there was an increase in the total population in the county of about 1.4 people also. So people are coming in to take these jobs. What type of people are coming in, and how is that affecting the composition of the local population? Well, here I show changes in the adult population by education group. The blue bar shows the percent of the initial population accounted for by that group. So, for example, about 30% of the adult population in the average county had less than a high school education in this study period, in this study area in 2000. The red bar shows the percent of the population change accounted for by that education group. So again, sticking with the less than high school group, we see that although they account for a large share of the population, they accounted for none of the population increase. Even there was a small decrease in that group. Whereas the high school educated, those with some college and those with college or more, all of them saw increases in their population. So this is an industry that is attracting people with some skills. Or alternatively, the increase in rental rates are potentially driving out lower income, lower educated residents. Either of those could be holding to varying degrees. Public finance is an issue that hasn't been discussed as much as I think it will be. Booming production means booming public revenues in many cases at various levels of government, from the state downward. But of course, it also represents, there are also liabilities assumed. Generally, the net effect is positive, at least according to a fairly thorough study by some folks at Duke University's Center for Energy. Much of the revenue is generated at the state level through severance taxes, or in the case of Pennsylvania, through impact fees. But in several, in fact, quite a few states, there's substantial local revenues generated through property taxes, and specifically taxing the value of oil and gas rights. And again, my study with colleagues, we found that this appreciation, or this increase in the property tax base, led to greater school spending and revenue, and ultimately housing values. To make that more concrete, this is looking across school districts that are inside the Barnett Shale in Texas and those just outside of it. And this is looking at different categories of property in thousands of dollars per student in the school district. And the takeaway point here is that the expansion in the tax base is driven largely by the value of oil and gas rights. The bluish line there, which is oil and gas rights, you can see shale and non-shale school districts had very similar levels of oil and gas property tax base in the beginning, and by later in the study period, oil and gas rights had added $80,000 per student in shale school districts relative to non-shale school districts. Unsurprisingly, that translated into, or at least contributed to, greater appreciation of housing in shale areas. Now here I show the line is the non-residential property tax base, so that includes the oil and gas right, plus commercial property, plus land and other, everything other than the residential property tax base. That's the line. The bar is a measure of the difference in housing values across shale and non-shale areas. And you can see they track quite closely. Our property tax data only go up to 2011, but I can tell you that is going to continue to decline because drilling has been declining in the Barnett Shale, and with it, the value of oil and gas rights, and with it, the difference in housing values between shale and non-shale areas. Lastly, agriculture. There are some interesting intersections between unconventional oil and gas development and agriculture. First is the issue of competition for water. That's certainly going to be more of an issue in parts of the arid west than in the Marcellus Shale in the east. I haven't seen much research on this question. I don't know if it's too much more than an anecdotal popular press story or if it's systematically having major increases in water scarcity and in areas. So that's an area open for research. There's also certainly the potential for competition for labor. This is an industry that's using a lot of truck drivers, a lot of people with skills at operating heavy equipment, and you could easily imagine that people who are working on farms would move into the oil and gas industry, probably find it easy to find well-paying jobs there. Those first 2 points are where the two industries maybe compete against each other. The third point is where they complement each other. Royalty income, that is the income that is paid by drilling companies to the owner of the oil and gas that they're extracting, is substantial. And for farmers alone, we estimated using data from farm-level data that's nationally representative, we found that there were about $2.3 billion in lease and royalty payments paid to farms in 2011. To put that in context, the direct payment program, which the 2014 Farm Bill eliminated, had an annual outlay of around $5 billion. So this is about half of that. And if you imagine either production doubling or prices doubling, then that would put these royalty payments roughly on par with the direct payment program, which had been for many years the largest farm program payment in the U.S. A caveat there, of course, is that these payments are far more concentrated than farm program payments. It's a small percentage of farms that are receiving payments, but those receiving payments are receiving large payments. And you can certainly imagine that these payments might influence investment on the farm or activity choices, commodity specialization. If I'm a medium to small dairy farmer and struggling, and I have a large windfall of royalty payments, I would certainly find it attractive to stop getting up in the morning to milk and switch my dairy cows for beef cattle, or to do a similar switch that requires less of my labor but can keep me on the farm nonetheless. But we don't have good research on if royalty payments are having those types of influences on farm decisions. The royalty income, of course, is generated through the ownership of oil and gas rights. And if those oil and gas rights are owned by the people who also own the surface rights, then we may be seeing this oil and gas development manifest itself in certain areas in higher farm real estate values. But that would depend heavily on whether or not the surface owner is also the subsurface owner. And that certainly varies across the country. Here are data looking at the Barnett Shale in Texas and the northeastern part of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. And we're looking at the median percent change in farm real estate values across different 5-year periods. I can tell you in Pennsylvania, drilling boomed in the 2007 to 2012 period. Drilling did not occur just across the border in New York, and that's what this comparison is based on. And if you see the bars to the right, the blue bars corresponding to the appreciation from 2007 to 2012, there was similar appreciation of farm real estate on the Pennsylvania side compared to the New York side. That was not true in the prior 5-year period, 2002 to 2007, when there was dramatically greater appreciation of farm real estate on the Pennsylvania side. This would have been the period when, not when drilling occurred, but when the rights to drill would have been leased. So it's not surprising that that effect on farm real estate values anticipated the drilling and came quite before it. Development in the Barnett happened earlier. There, the leasing period would have been around 2002, early in the 2000s. And they're comparing the farms in the shale with those just outside the shale. We see that there is greater appreciation within the shale, but it's quite modest. And this, I think, suggests that subsurface ownership by farms in the Barnett is far more limited. And we also looked at property tax payments, because these farmers should be paying property taxes on any oil and gas rights that they own. And in fact, property tax payments by farms in the Barnett did not go up relative to farms outside the Barnett. So that's further confirmation that we think that there are a lot of split estates there, and farmers generally do not own their subsurface rights. I'll just close again with this graph, with this depiction of where natural gas production is growing. Again, I think a takeaway point is that we are not at the crest before the crash, but we are at the beginning of a much longer secular increase in at least natural gas production, potentially a shorter increase in oil production, but there's a lot of uncertainty around this. But what is certain is that the issues surrounding oil and gas development and their local consequences will not be going away, and we will be talking about them for quite a few years to come. The data that I mentioned in the first half of the presentation are available in this first link, along with substantial documentation. Even further documentation is available upon request. Again, it was an extensive effort to compile these data, and we have 45 pages of documentation detailing all sorts of details around the data. And then there's also a short Amber Waves article describing and using these data in some descriptive comparisons at the county level. I mentioned quite a few studies, and they're referenced here, just in case you want to have more details on them. And then lastly, here's my contact information, my ERS email, which will be working until August 7th, and after which my Pittsburgh email. I will be at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and will be continuing to work in this field in that area, which is itself experiencing substantial natural gas drilling. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing questions and hopefully responding intelligently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We are going to pass to questions at this point. We're going to take some questions from the audience that is in the room. I will please ask you to just stand up at the mic, indicate your name and your affiliation, and ask the question. And in the meantime, Kate from the Office of the Chief Economist is going to be writing down all the questions that we will be accepting from the webinar portion of the seminar, and we will take those after we take the ones from the audience. So if there's any questions at this point, please stand up and share it with everybody.
This is Marianne Rosum from USDA. I was wondering if there are any studies on some of the environmental damage, such as either well water ruined or some of the earthquakes from some of the fracking fluids pumped back in the ground.
I haven't seen any, well, there are studies out there, and it's tough to draw conclusive evidence. There are certainly well-documented cases of individual properties that have had contamination, either of methane leakage or some form in parts of Pennsylvania, or where fracking fluids or produced water, that is water that then comes back from after you inject it down, comes back, and there have been cases where that has been mismanaged, or leaks have occurred, or it's spilled into the surface water. On the surface water issue, the best study that I've seen is done in using Pennsylvania as an example, and it finds generally that the water quality in streams located in test taken from downstream of wells generally didn't indicate poor water quality, looking primarily at total dissolved solids. They did see some increase in salinity, but below kind of EPA levels. I think the groundwater issue is more murky. There's just mixed evidence, and I haven't seen any observational studies. There's some kind of controlled studies looking at 1 or 2 wells that have found mixed results. There's some folks from Duke University that seem to have found some leakage, and other ones from the University of Pittsburgh that in their 8 or so wells they didn't have that problem. But you know, it's a challenging issue because you can drill test wells and find what happens in your test well, but that may be different from the hundreds of wells drilled out in the field. So sometimes I think that can be a bit apples and oranges. So I think what we really want to know is what's happening from the hundreds of wells drilled out in the field, not from, you know, the 5 closely monitored wells that we happen to pick for our study. And I haven't seen those types of studies, which I think would be the most credible. But it's an area where research is happening. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Adam Hancock with the American Farm Bureau. I was just curious if there was any, or if you've done any research on the effects of agricultural production, the costs for that with the development of natural gas industry with respect to like irrigation or grain drying because of propane costs and like fertilizer production.
I'm looking at that right now. Anecdotally, I think production costs have increased generally, locally, in areas experiencing development. How much, and has it been enough to affect production? I'm not sure. In areas, for example, in northeastern Pennsylvania, you have 2 cross-cutting effects. One is it may be harder to keep labor on the farm, and land might be a bit more expensive because people have more money to bid prices up. But then the other effect is farmers have more money to work with, or many of them, to the extent that they own their oil and gas rights, and that is, at least anecdotally, allowed them to pay off debts, increase investment, expand their scale to a more profitable level. Now, out west, where you have the additional issue of water and their competition with the industry, I'm not sure. You know, I would say probably agriculture is benefiting in parts of the Northeast where there isn't that competition for water, and it's unclear in the West for this water issue. But there really isn't systematic research out there yet, but myself and colleagues at ERS are working on precisely that question, using data from the 2012 Census of Agriculture and past censuses.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Jeremy, Bill Janis with USDA Foreign Agricultural Service. How do subsurface property rights differ among U.S. states in your data set?
Well, that is a very good question, and I wish I had a very good answer to give it. And the short answer is that in this Texas-Pennsylvania comparison, we're inferring information about the presence of split estates and mineral ownership by effects on real estate values. We don't have direct information on, do you own your oil and gas rights? We're hoping to collect some of that information in surveys that will eventually be going into the field from the USDA, but we don't have that information, and to be honest, nobody does on an extensive level because it's very costly to obtain. You can go to county courthouses and dig through records and find that, but I have not seen anything that's very systematic on that issue. But it certainly varies by state, and it probably varies to the extent that the area had historic development of oil and gas if the rights had value at some point in the past, there would have been pressure to split them and sell them. But hard data to show that we don't have.
My name is Chelsea Berger, and I'm coming from the USDA Forest Service. So out west where water rights are not riparian and can be owned by entities not connected to streams or the groundwater, will there be anyone looking into how that affects the price of purchasing and or leasing those rights as oil and gas and fracturing moves out west? Or do you anticipate those prices fluctuating over time?
Are you talking about the value of the oil and gas rights or the value of the water in the area, in the local area?
The value of the water right.
The value of the water right. I would expect that they would be increasing. Again, this is area where research is just beginning to really dig into that, and I don't have a good answer to it. Some back-of-the-envelope calculations for, say, the Bakken Shale suggest that the amount of water used for irrigation for, say, alfalfa in western North Dakota is massive compared to the total amount probably used by the industry. But that's not to say what the industry is using isn't having a market effect on the price of water in the area. I can't give a good answer to that, but you're not the only one asking that question.
Jim Crutchfield from USDA. Given all the anecdotal stories as well as the studies, and some I guess more conclusive than others, are states regulating this? I mean, I don't really understand the regulation of fracking and use of the chemicals used in the industry, but are states taking it on, or is this something EPA would do, or what's the
It's primarily a state issue. To the extent that states are involved in multi-state regional watershed partnerships, which are coordinated through the EPA for compliance with federal standards, then there's an indirect channel for federal policy to address the industry. But most of the regulation of oil and gas drilling happens at the state level in their state Department of Environmental Protections or oil and gas commissions, and that's where it's at.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Well, we have one more question, and then I'm going to take questions from the online audience. So again, just as a reminder, if you are online, please type your questions in the question box, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Thank you, Kate. I had written down a couple questions, and some of those are clarifying. We mentioned the UPGAR index for infants, and I was wondering if you could please describe that a little bit, because there may be some members of the audience that are not familiar with it.
I was hoping nobody was going to ask that, because as I was reviewing my presentation, I wondered, what does that stand for? I think it's a mixture of weight, and it's a mixture of different aspects of infant health. What components go into it, I don't know. Maybe somebody here knows that off the top of their head. She also, just to simplify it, looked at low birth weight, which is another general measure of infant health, and found similar effects. I should have used the low birth weight, because that was the one that I understood.
And there was one question that's coming in from our webinar audience that asks about the granularity of the data. And to kind of follow up to that, how come we're looking at county level, and is there data available, or could there be in the future in a smaller granular level?
Somebody handed me a definition of the UPGAR, and I'll just quick read that for the audience, and we'll all be educated. APGAR is a quick test performed on a baby 1 to 5 minutes after birth. The 1-minute score determines how well the baby tolerated the birthing process. It measures the breathing effort, the heart rate, muscle tone, reflexes, and skin color. There you go on the APGAR. As far as more granular data, yes, and that's the next frontier. The Energy Information Administration, when we shared them this data, they were excited because this is the direction that they're trying to move some of their data products, and they're working with some institutions to develop a database of actual well-level data with the spatial data to pinpoint the exact location of those wells and then the production associated with them over time. I think they might be several years away from that, but you can go to state agencies and in some cases get well-leveled data and spatial data to locate those wells. I know you can do that for Pennsylvania. Somebody's compiled that and made it publicly available. And the availability of well data varies then for the remaining across states.
And another question is the data available right now to the public, and would it be updated, the county level data, in the future, and is it easily updated?
The data are available to the public through the links that are at the end of the slide or the end of the presentation. It will certainly be much easier to update the data set than it was to create it, but would not be a small feat to update it. It would be certainly take a concerted effort, and currently there are no plans to update it, but that could change based on feedback and demand and use.
And by the way, I broke my own rule. This is Irene Xiarjos with the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses. At this point, I'm going to ask Kate to please follow up with some questions that came in from the audience in the webinar.
Great, thank you so much. So we have some really nice questions from our online audience, and I'm just going to read a couple of those, so we'll address as many as we can get to. I just want to start by asking, will this be shared, the presentation be shared? We have quite a few people wanting to know information about that, so I'm just going to ask Irene to answer that really quickly.
Sorry to take the spotlight for a minute. We are going to be sharing this at the USDA Economist Group website. We're going to be sharing the presentation. And then if we're lucky and the technical problems that we were having earlier did not impact our ability to record the session, we're also going to be sharing it, the whole webinar, through CFAIR.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to start with one here. You say that we're not at the crest yet, but it seems that the crest will be felt at different times. Do you have a sense of how the shale and oil and gas development will move around the country, crest, if at all?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And there are several dimensions to it. As oil prices stay well above natural gas prices, and they used to move very close together, but when this boom in natural gas production occurred, they deviated, and the spread was in favor of oil. And so the drilling resources have gone to oil-rich areas. As that spread changes, that will change. Of course, most of the oil coming out of shale right now is coming from North Dakota and the Eagle Ford in southern Texas, and to the extent that natural gas prices come back, we start exporting it, for example, then we would see some of those resources go back into developing, say, the Haynesville Shale on the Texas-Louisiana border, which saw a tremendous increase in production, but then when prices fell, drilling disappeared, basically. So it is true we're not at the crest, but for certain regions, there will be crest and crashes as prices evolve. And another thing to point out is that if you look at the production curve for entire fields, for example, the Barnett, it shows that production is now declining. But it's difficult to interpret that. I've talked with people who said that primarily reflects the decline in natural gas prices, decreased drilling. The moment those prices rebound, more resources will go into drilling, and that trend will reverse. So it less reflects the quantity of gas in the Barnett and more reflects the amount of investment going in to extract it, which is a function of prices. So all that to say, yes, drilling across the country will rise and fall as prices change, and they favor oil areas over gas areas or vice versa.
Great. We have another question here. Why was $20 million established as the threshold for reporting county data? And is there more granularity than that?
Yeah, the data are in the data set are the actual production numbers in 1,000 cubic feet for gas and in barrels for oil. So that's a continuous measure. You know for each county the exact production in each year. The $20 million cutoff was simply for descriptive purposes, and something we did for an Amber Waves article. And we picked that threshold because it was, if you have a $20 million increase in production in the county, that's generating roughly $3 million in royalty income, which we thought, that's an economically meaningful amount of royalty income that we want to pick up, and so we just use that as a threshold.
Great. We have another question. How did you separate the financial impacts of oil and gas industries from others in terms of assessing correlations in the data?
The financial impacts, are we talking about public finance or local economic outcomes? I'll answer both, I suppose, because the idea is the same. To identify the cause of growth in the industry and its impact apart from other things that are changing over time, we went through a lot of pain to pick areas that are over shale formations and areas that are in the same regional economy that are outside of the shale formation. And you can verify whether or not these are good comparisons by looking, well, was their employment, their tax base, and other types of indicators, were they growing at similar rates prior to the development of these technologies and drilling? If they were growing at rates that were indistinguishable from each other, then that suggests these are appropriate comparisons. That is, the counties or the areas just outside of the shale represent a good counterfactual. What would happen had drilling not occurred? And then the inference comes from of course, comparing across those two counties, and the difference is then the effect of the industry.
Great, thanks. We have another question. Does the data differentiate between conventional extraction and fracking output?
No, it doesn't. And there's a good reason for that. One, the states generally don't make that distinction, and so we couldn't do it. But the other issue is that there's a mix. It's not black and white whether or not it's a conventional versus unconventional well. And that's defined differently for different people. You might have a vertical well that's hydraulically fractured. You may have a horizontal well that isn't hydraulically fractured. You can have different applications of technologies, and then what constitutes a shale formation versus are we also considering sandstone. So, the oil is oil, and gas is gas. So to break it out isn't not a great reason for it. Though certainly, if you wanted to compare conventional wells and their local impact from unconventional wells, I think that would be a meaningful comparison.
Great.
I just wanted to note that it is after 3 o'clock, but since we had a few technical difficulties at the beginning, we're going to keep on going with the questions, maybe 5-7 minutes over.
Great. So we have an online attendee wondering if you could speak a little bit to the effect of shale extraction boom on agriculture and producers through its effect on railroad transportation.
That's a channel through which I have to confess ignorance. Rail transportation certainly has changed in parts of the country, in the Midwest and Dakotas, as a lot of rail has gone to shipping oil out of the Bakken to other parts of the country, to the refineries. And I have no idea what the implications of that have been for agriculture, but you can imagine that there might be some. But I have not looked into that, and I haven't seen anybody who has. That's a good question.
Oh, no, I'm on the spot. Hi, this is Marina Denikoff. I'm with Agricultural Marketing Service, and agricultural transportation is my division, the name of my division. So we have been writing briefing papers. I'm not the rail analyst, but from what I understand, there is a significant impact on those Bakken Valley producers of corn and soybeans and wheat. And they are captive to one railroad up there, BNSF. Right. And BNSF is beginning to, I think, build another track to accommodate the boom. It's a long-term, as your graph showed, long-term phenomenon. So it's something we're following. Not easily quantified. Prices of shipping have gone up, and the impact on grain bases is palpable in those states. And grain bases, by the way, is a difference in futures and cash prices. So farmers are getting less money from their crops. So your decision-making at the farm level is not just, on cattle. It's also on cash crops that has multiple implications. So that's kind of a
great to know.
Little bit.
Just really quickly, also just keep an eye on what South Dakota State University is doing in their economics department. I know that they're aware of these changes and eyeing these research questions as well. So
that was Karen from CFAIR, and this is Irene Ciarjos from the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses. I did also want to indicate that there has been a lot of policy interest on this issue, and I wanted to follow up and ask Jeremy, what are the topics that are currently being researched with this data? You mentioned a number of universities that are already using the data. Are there any topics that are different than the ones that have already been presented in the in the literature and that you presented to us today?
I don't have a good handle on all the ways that the data are being used. I do know that one example is understanding where oil and gas firms decide to locate establishments. Do you need some minimal, what's the minimal number of firms and related infrastructure for them to use your county as kind of a regional hub? Because when they develop a region, of course, they put their headquarters somewhere, and the establishments tend to cluster. So that's just one example, but I don't have a good example of other uses beyond the issues that we've seen, kind of employment and income issues.
Jeremy, I don't know if you already talked about if the data is separated for oil and gas or not.
They are separate. So there's oil production and gas production, separate variables for each year, 2000 to 2011.
Okay, and then a final question from me is for the agricultural impacts that you mentioned. Can you speak on differences on the timing of where we see those impacts, for example, for employment versus for the rights and the royalties that come from there?
I would expect that the employment effects and the competition for labor and the competition for water, those are going to be contemporaneous with drilling. The influence of lease and royalty payments on farm decisions are going to be contemporaneous with drilling, because the leases need to be signed and the bonuses paid before drilling happens. But then royalties, which are based on a share of production, only occur once production starts to flow. So that effect can be maybe felt longer into the future.
Thank you very much. In relation to the agricultural impacts, I also wanted to let the audience know that the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses is working with Penn State on looking on ag impacts, so we will have some results to share probably in the next year. And I think at this point, we maybe 10 minutes after 3 o'clock, we are finishing up. I want to thank our presenter for giving us such a wonderful discussion of all these topics, not only during the presentation, but also afterwards. And I will please ask the audience that is here in the room to join me in applauding him. And then I want to indicate that everything that was presented here reflects the research and opinions of the presenter, not USDA or CFAIR or ERS or the Office of Energy Policy or the USDA economist group. Everybody's laughing. And that we want to thank the audience for joining us, both in the room with us and everybody that has been online with us. We appreciate that you were patient with all the technical difficulties that we had earlier. We know that Jeremy is going to be leaving in the second week of August, so we wanted to make sure that we got this before he was leaving, so we had to get everything ready in a very short amount of time. And if the webinar has been recorded, it will be shared through CFAIR, and the presentation is going to be shared through the USDA Economist Group website immediately after, maybe tomorrow. So thank you very much for your attendance. And thank you very much, Jeremy, and we can now close the webinar. Have a very good day.